The 11th week of this legislative session has come to an end. We're looking at just 5 weeks of session left. And while there are several things that we want to address today, we think the most important thing to discuss first, before we get into the politics and the policy of this building, is the passing of one of our colleagues and our friend this week, Representative David Brumbaugh. Just today, they brought Representative Brumbaugh's body here to lie in state. And the ceremony this morning, bringing him into the Capitol, was an emotional one. It demonstrated to all of us that at the end of the day, it's not whether we're Democrats or Republicans. We're all Oklahomans. We're all people, and we all have just a finite amount of time on this earth. And so our thoughts and prayers from the House Democratic Caucus go out to Representative Brumbaugh's family and to all the members of the House Republican Caucus to whom he served as a leader. And our hope is that they can find peace and comfort and closure in short time, and we hope the same for our colleagues as well. With that being said, it's an awkward transition, but it needs to happen. There are other things that dealt with policy this week at the state capitol that should be concerning for the citizens of Oklahoma. With only 5 weeks left, we still have an $878 million budget hole for next year that's only been exacerbated by the robbing of the rainy day fund and the county improvement for roads and bridges funds and the unclaimed property fund to the tune of over $320 million. When you put it all together, there's over $1.2 billion that the House Republicans have got to find to just keep things flat so that education, healthcare, and public safety don't look at further cuts. And this week, even though our caucus rolled out our $1.4 billion Restoring Oklahoma plan over a month and a half ago, and we kept hearing week after week after week that the House Republicans had a plan. They truly had a plan. We said, we heard maybe it was going to be 2 weeks ago, and we saw nothing. Maybe it was going to be last week, and we saw nothing. We hoped that this week we would see some sort of plan, but instead what we saw were 5 bills that raised a total of $29 million, and they only heard 3 of them on the House floor this week to the tune of $20 million net to the state coffers. $20 million towards a $1.2 billion budget hole would be laughable if it wasn't so serious for the people that were affected by it. Our caucus continues to call for the House Republicans to put their plan on the table. So far to date, they haven't. All this week, every member of my caucus took the opportunity to stand up and ask the same 2 questions to every member of the Republican majority who was running a bill. They asked them if the bill had any recurring revenue in it, and the answer almost unanimously to every single question was no, it doesn't. And they asked if it had any positive impact to the budget, and the answer to almost every one of those questions was no. We spent a week, heard over 100 bills, and yet did virtually nothing to help the $1.2 billion budget hole that our citizens are facing. And with only 5 weeks left, our caucus is concerned that in reality they may not actually have a plan after all. Because what we're hearing is that next week we may have a gas tax rolled out at us, or we may have a new tax on cable services, or something along those lines, which from our caucus's perspective only means one thing, that the majority party hasn't learned their lesson. Their income tax cuts, their gross production tax cuts, and their tax credits and giveaways that bankrupted this state apparently are going to be paid for by raising taxes on middle-class families as they just try to drive to work or try to watch their favorite TV show on Friday night. Our caucus will stand opposed to those measures because at the end of the day, you don't solve the budget problem by raising taxes on middle-class families. You do it by restoring those cuts that put us into this mess, in particular the gross production tax cut. Our caucus still has amendments on the floor to raise the gross production tax to either 7% or 5%. We want to give the Republicans an option. They can choose whatever they want. We'll support either one and bring in either $300 million or $500 million into the state's coffers to try to close that $1.2 billion budget hole. But to date, they simply balked at it and instead are offering up more tax increases on middle-class families. And the last thing that I'll note is this. They said last year that when they took out a $200 million bond, basically took out the state's credit card and put our budget on the state's credit card, that they wouldn't do it again. They said it's just going to be a one-time deal. They were just going to do a $200 million bond last year to help balance the budget. But this year, because they refused to raise recurring revenues, they're talking again about a $300 million bond that only blows a huge hole into the budget next year when that bond goes away and forces us to make interest payments for the next 15 years on the bond. It only pushes us further into debt. It is not fiscally responsible or even fiscally conservative to balance the budget on a state's credit card. And our caucus, if they choose to do that and ignore recurring revenues like gross production tax cuts, income tax cuts, and tax credits, if they ignore those recurring revenues in favor of a $300 million credit card debt for the state. Our caucus will stand opposed to it, and we hope that there are at least 25 members of the Republican majority who are willing to adhere to their conservative principles and oppose it with us and prevent the state from going further into debt to balance their fiscal mismanagement. Our caucus does not support a gasoline tax. Our caucus supports restoring income taxes, gross production tax cuts, and tax credits and giveaways. We can raise the money that we need to balance the state's budget that way without raising taxes on middle-class families. And from our perspective, it's immoral to look at the citizens of Oklahoma and say, we're going to raise gas taxes on you, middle-class families, but we won't raise gas taxes on billionaire corporations when it comes to the gross production tax. It just doesn't work for us.